Okay, so we have today an interview with Roland Perry, the author of Oliphant. Welcome, Roland, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Warwick. A great pleasure to be here.
Hey, first up, what motivated you to write a biography about Mark Oliphant?
Well, there were two distinct answers to that. First of all, I'd interviewed him at length in 1994 over another book of mine called The Fifth Man. It's since been renamed, but that came out. It was a spy book, an espionage non-fiction book about the Cambridge spies who were all recruited by the Russians in World War II. And Oliphant had some equipment stolen from his laboratory by one of the spies, Victor Rothschild, and they knew each other from Cambridge. And I thought, wow, I've got to get onto him, Oliphant. I was really worried about Rothschild, but once I got interviewing Oliphant, I was absolutely entranced with the brilliance of the man and the way he covered the terrain of World War II and the 30s with the whole splitting of the atom, and he was a key player at this point. So that was the first thing. The second thing, and now what happens with me, I'm on my 42nd book at the moment. This is my 41st book, Oliphant. And what happens is if you're in it for the duration like me, you come across, Warwick O'Neill was not a bad bloke, very interesting. I may do that biography. You keep notes, so forth, and it's quite often it drops back to number 20 in an agenda. As I say, but I went to see the film Oppenheimer, and it was such a Barry Crocker, a shocker. Didn't mention him at all. This is the greatest scientist of that era who created the atomic bomb, who created radar in the sense of he didn't invent it, but he was the one that actually got it as a war weapon for the Brits, as a defensive weapon to start with, and then as a war weapon in planes and so forth. And I thought, what is going on? They don't even have him in the index on which the film was based, in the book on which the film was based. So I've only done that twice in my illustrious career. I have walked out after an event and said I have to do a book. The other one, are you a cricket fan, Warwick?
Not
No,
not entirely, no, but
doesn't matter. No, I was at Lord's in the Compton stand. They're the cheap seats at about $300. And Jofra Archer, a very brilliant fast bowler, the fastest bowler since Larwood that England have had, I believe. He knocked over Steve Smith. That's right. He knocked him over, and I couldn't believe the cheering that went on at Lord's for the fact that another Australian batsman had been felled by a very quick bowler. And I walked out and said, I'm going to do a book. Now, as I walked out of the film Oppenheimer, I said, I have to dig out all those files and everything I had on him. He was long gone. He died in 2000. He was around for the entire of the 20th century. He was 99. So since Federation, Oliphant had been around. So that's how the book came about, because I just thought this has to be corrected. It's such a travesty. The Americans have totally ignored the key player and put an American, Oppenheimer, who was a physicist, but not in the same league in terms of developing the bomb, not even the same universe. So I said, got to do it. And fortunately, I had all those notes, and they came alive after 30 years, That was it. So I then went about the proper research, the deep research, but I had the great advantage of having questioned him a lot.
yeah, yeah, that's unfortunately that seems to be the case with Hollywood, isn't it? They'll
Oh,
keep what makes a good
this
story and,
this
and leave the
this
rest of
wasn't
it out.
just this wasn't just a precious author thinking, oh, they've missed out my character. It was like saying Churchill, nah, did he really have anything to do with World War II? We won't put him in the index. That's what it was like. I mean, I'll come to that. I'll explain that analogy if you like, but his was appalling, and I hope the book has an impact in the States. And this fraud, maybe an unwitting one, maybe if they decide, oh well, who was he? He was English, or he was in England and he was Australian. Well, we can ignore that. We can ignore Superman, we can ignore Churchill. You know, so
Yeah.
it was just preposterous. So that's why I did the book, and it's come alive because I had that drive with it. There was something behind it for me, And it wasn't that complicated. I've done more biography than anyone in the English language, about 20 or 19 and one memoir on
Mm.
Don Bradman. And I found him quite uncomplicated in many respects. It was episodic, but he did change, he developed his mind. He wasn't a robot. At one point he was messianic about getting the bomb. And after the war, when the bombs were dropped, he was not so keen on nuclear weapons, but it's complicated. It's not complicated. It's just that episodically he changed under certain circumstances.
Yeah.
So I found him a fascinating character, and having knowing what he was like personally was tremendously uplifting for me because you just don't bump into these guys, Bradman and company. You don't bump into them every day.
Yeah. So, for those who don't know him, who was Mark Oliphant? And
Right.
based on your time with him, what type of man was he?
Yeah. Well, it was unusual. I was asked this question earlier today in an interview, and it was put slightly barbed away. He didn't get in. He didn't have a great academic record. Well, that's true. He didn't get into Adelaide University in the subjects he wanted, and he had to work part-time as a jeweler making rings, and
Okay.
he got one for his fiance. So he had to go the hard way, but he got in, and he got into the physics laboratory studying physics, and that's where he came alive. That's where he was bombarding uranium. He got hold of some uranium, bombarding it to see if there was any reaction. And he got it reactions. He didn't know at 18, 19, 18 he was. He didn't know that he was getting an atomic reaction. Very small, like a pool table size thing with bullets of protons and so forth being fired at deuterium, sorry, at uranium, and getting a result. So he then just developed an absolute passion for this work, and then he wrote a paper on mercury, of all things, and no one had done that, and that got him into Cambridge University, the greatest laboratory ever, and that was at Cavendish under the great Lord Rutherford, who happened to be a Kiwi, but he'd been there 40 years, and he was part Pom, part Kiwi, and they got on like a house on fire. And the reason when he joined the Cavendish was that here was Oliphant, an absolute practitioner. He was an experimenter. He wanted to go into the lab every day, even if he got electrocuted, and he got electrocuted twice. Once, once the soles of his shoes were sealed to the floor of the lab, and they thought he was dead. He was on his back. Rutherford came in thinking, "Oh, I've killed, the great protege." No, he was up in the lab firing things the next day. So he was outstanding. And Rutherford, now you've got to remember the milieu was amazing. There were probably 20, I counted 22 Nobel laureates working around this Cambridge University lab over about 40 years from 1900, right? Absolutely incredible brain power there, all fascinated by splitting the atom. This was the big thing. They started to think themselves as God because they could do things with the atom that no one else could, that sort of thing. Physicists, but not just POMs or Australians. They were a collegiate group before the war. Russians were there. A guy called Peter Kapitsa, another first-rate physicist, a Russian, who was, of course, sending everything he could back to Russia at that point. But it was collegiate. Everyone did it. The Italians knew what the Brits were doing. They were writing papers. I did not detect much jealousy or anything like that. They all wanted to build and move forward with this technology. That all changed with the war, of course, and then you had the Russians sealing things off, and we wanted to stop them getting the bomb after the war, the hydrogen bomb and so forth. So it all changed, but he had a collegiate mentality. He hated government interfering with physicists, and for one reason, they were superior intellects than any politician, but they didn't believe in national boundaries. It was
Yeah.
all dealing with your mate in Russia and Germany and everywhere. So he Rutherford died in 37 after I'd written a magnificent paper in 1934, which was published in the Bible for scientists called Nature in 1934. And in that, he outlined what was called thermonuclear fusion, and that is the hydrogen bomb, right? Now,
Yeah.
he was involved earlier in 32 with discovering that hydrogen had other variants isotopes. So there's hydrogen, just to simplify it, it's better than doing it any other way. Hydrogen we know, hydrogen that we call it hydrogen one, hydrogen two, which was heavy water, but just call it hydrogen two, and hydrogen three, which was tritium. And that was just a variant which could do all sorts of magical things and was used actually in helping the detonation of bombs later on, if that's worth reporting, but it was. So he was right on the ball. He was absolutely doing brilliant work at the Cavendish. And then he joined Birmingham Laboratory. Rutherford was very miffed about this, but he realized the great protege had to move on. So he became Rutherford, if you like, at Birmingham. Then Rutherford died, and Oliphant was left right at the point of the conflict, World War II, and that he just lifted another level. He said, "Well, we have to have a bomb to stop the Nazis." Now, he wasn't a Jew. He was, he was no religion at all by this stage. He was basically an agnostic, but he had this messianic drive, and part of the reason was the two Jewish emigres, Fritz and Perls, running away from Nazi Germany, as several of his employers were, Oliphant's employers were. They said, the West has to get on with this because the Germans, they knew, all the physicists, they're developing a bomb. They're going to get there first. So Oliphant, very competitive in an Aussie way, said, no, they're not. We're going to build the bomb first. We're going to do it. The trouble was he had about six great hurdles to jump. I'll name them: Einstein, Oppenheimer, Niels Bohr, Max Born, and a guy called George Thomson, a Nobel laureate. So these great 20th century physicists said to Oliphant and the world, no, it can't be done. You can't get a detonation out of uranium. You can't split off the U-235. You can if you have 100 tons of it. But where are you going to put 100 tons? If you want to blow up the Melbourne Cricket Ground, you've got to take 100 tons there and detonate it there. And they all said, no, it can't be done. Here's Oliphant. I mean, remember the record he's got. He's already made huge discoveries, and he's worked with the greatest overlord, if you like, Lord Rutherford, in this area. And he said, well, we're going to do it. And he had these two brilliant physicists who'd come from Nazi Germany, and they just worked on it. He had two labs going at once. This is what he was like. He had a radar lab, which was vitally important, and he had the nuclear lab going, the atomic lab. And in the end, he was the one that said, right, I want all these scientists to work together and put together a paper. We're going to get it up to the War Office, which means Churchill, the Prime Minister. So he had all the Brits in front of him at a place called Burlington Arcade, which is in Piccadilly in London. This is when the Luftwaffe was dropping bombs on them every day. This was a very dangerous time. He missed death. He was very lucky on a couple of occasions. And that emphasized to him that he had to move. He had to really sprint to get this done. So he's sitting in front of all these Brits. You've heard of Ron Barassi?
Yep.
He's
Yep.
Ron Barassi on steroids, is all I can say, in front of these people, right? Now, Ron
Yep.
was a brilliant speaker and very direct and articulate. Now, this was Oliphant in front of these incredible group of Brits, bureaucrats, politicians, and scientists. And he said, look, what you've delivered me at his instigation, he said, now you do this, you do that. You've delivered me 30 pages of scientific gobbledygook. He said, I don't want uber calculus in it. I don't want graphs. And he said, I'll give you a little homily from Lord Rutherford. And Rutherford would say to a physicist handing him a paper, he'd say, see the char lady, the cleaning lady over there? This is in front of other physicists. If she can't understand what you've done, you don't understand it. So he said
All
that in front
right.
of all these Brits, and he ended up saying, I want 3 pages, which I'll edit. I want 3 pages and this incredible line for all these polished, tertiary educated Brits. I want it to be in English because it's got to get up to the war cabinet. Can you imagine the gall? But of course, none of them said it. He was prickly for them, but no
Mm.
one really did anything to stop him because he was so brilliant. Anyway, it got up to Churchill. I wish I had a cigar here. It got to the war cabinet, and Churchill, I'm paraphrasing, I've got it, the actual quote in the book, but it's something like this. Oh, I thought we had enough explosives, but I suppose something like this we could do as well, you know. Because that was the green light from the mighty Winston.
Yep.
And the big problem was the Brits were strapped. They had no money. The war was going on, and they needed the support of the Americans. Now, the Americans were asleep at the wheel at this point. They had their ambassador, Joe Kennedy, telling them, "Don't worry about the Nazis. Let the Germans win. There's nothing to be done." Right? So Joe's telling him, this is Jack Kennedy's father, the
Yep.
ambassador to the UK, and the Americans. No one had bombed them, and they thought, well, it doesn't matter much. Oliphant said he was asked to go over and find out what had happened to the paper that had been delivered about U-235 and how to make it. And this clown called Lyman Briggs, who was an agriculturalist, he wasn't a physicist, had stuck it in a safe because Roosevelt had set up a sort of a committee to look at this stuff, and they didn't know anything about what Oliphant had delivered about splitting off the U-235. So it sat dormant in America, and he had finally, after getting no reaction from the top bureaucratic scientists, the ones working for the government, he went to his good mate called Ernst Lawrence, who was building a cyclotron at Berkeley University, and he was that's an atom smasher. So you got the Oliphant who loves smashing atoms, going to an American who loves smashing atoms, and explaining the U-235. They knew each other well, and in walks Robert Oppenheimer into the study. And he sits down, he's listening to Oliphant delivering his spiel. And at one point, Oppenheimer says, "Should we just be discussing this? Is top secret stuff." And Oliphant turned to him and said, "You don't know anything about this. Why you and Enrico," he said Fermi, but it was Enrico Fermi, another great
Mhm.
physicist from Italy who was living in the States, said, "You don't know anything about this. What's going on? We need you. We need the funds to build this bomb," right? So he was so driven.
Yep.
It got through. And then, of course, we had December the 7th, 1941. What happened then? The
77,
Japanese
1941, Japanese.
Japanese bombed
Yep.
them, and suddenly they
Yep.
knew what it was like, not on the scale the Brits were taking it in the
Yep.
neck, but they had it enough of a scale at Pearl Harbor to say, well, we have to have something. So that's when the whole thing got momentum in December 1941, and it went for a couple of years, and they were combining across the ocean. There was talk about a link, and Churchill had met Roosevelt, but Roosevelt got cold feet because he said he didn't have the faith in the scientists that Churchill did, knowing some of them, the 20 odd Nobel laureates there. He said, I'm not sure about the cost. It was the biggest cost of any government operation in history at that point. So here's the president saying, "Oh, we're going to spend billions on this thing. Do we know it's going to work?" And as we've all seen, they didn't know it was going to work right up until Los Alamos when they fired it. They didn't know what
Yep.
was going to happen. They didn't think about the fallout or anything. So anyway, if you haven't seen the film Oppenheimer, but in the film,
Yep.
the general, what was his name, Leslie Groves, has a meeting with Oliphant and another English physicist and Oppenheimer, and he said, "Well, we want you to work at Los Alamos." And this is Oliphant. This is how I love him. He said, "No, I'm going to go to Berkeley and work on the bomb fuel." And they said, "Oh, we need you to," he said, "No, engineers can build the frame for a bomb. That could take five. I could have five engineers do that in 2 weeks. I've got to make the fuel. If a car doesn't have petrol in it, it doesn't run. And if the bomb doesn't have U-235 and the other ingredients, it's not going to work." So they thought, well, we can't argue with that. He had to develop the
Yeah.
fuel. But then at the end of the meeting, because you could see what a powerhouse Oliphant was, he took him into the corridor and said, "Look, will you please talk to the president?" And Oliphant said, "Well, there's James Chadwick in there." He said, "No, he's a very nice British guy, but he's retiring, meaning he's not forceful." Oppenheimer was
Yep.
part of the team, and so he sent the great man Oliphant in to see the president at the White House. And after a 1 hour meeting, the green light was on for the atomic bomb. He said, "Right, we will fund it." Now, at that
Okay.
stage, as I say, they didn't know what was going. It was all nerve-wracking right up the finish. So here's Oliphant, gets it up to Churchill, gets it into the States, pushes it to Roosevelt in the finish, and that in 45 they were able to detonate experimentally at Los Angeles, and then of course the bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. So, and people say, I like reading about revisionist academics who say, oh, what a terrible thing it was. Yes, of course it was a terrible thing.
Yeah.
At least 100,000 human beings were perished in those two bombs, at least. And the
Yeah.
nuclear fallout and everything over the years. But you've got to talk to the Chinese. They'd lost 24 million of them to the Japanese attacks on
Yeah.
China from 1931. And do we think they're going to sit around saying, oh, well, the morality of this, we're not sure. They
Yeah.
were very happy, as we
Yeah.
were, Australians were, very happy. And there's a corollary point to that. This is how you look too young, but my parents and grandparents would have been shivering in their boots. My father fought, so he was not actually
Mhm.
shivering, he's in action. He was a bomber pilot and in New
Okay.
Guinea. And he would have no question about whether they drop a bomb because of the number of Americans and Australians that would have been brutalized in any land attack on Japan at that point. But it was fascinating to read and do the research and get the gritty, nitty gritty on this. In early 1946, the Prime Minister of Australia, Labor Prime Minister Ben Chifley, went with a delegation headed by Nugget Coombs, who was the finest economist we had, and Doc Evatt, probably the smartest politician, a barrister, but he was right up in the hierarchy of the Labor Party, led the Labor Party later. And they went to get Oliphant to come back to Australia. And why? I mean, he said, "Oh, that's wonderful. I'll start a university like Cambridge," and because he was touched by the fact that after 23 years, the echelons of the top of government wanted him back. It was flattering for him, and he said, "Well, we'll start an Australian National University. Great idea. We'll do it on the longs of, Cambridge and Oxford and so forth." And they said, "Well, yeah, we want that." And he said, "Well, what else?" They said, "We want the bomb." I
Okay.
stated, right, here's a Labor Prime Minister. He said, "Look, we want the nuclear industry, which was big in Oliphant's dreams. I mean, to have nuclear power." But the next step was to say, right, you want the bomb? Well, anything we do in the nuclear industry can be made screwdriver ready, meaning
Yeah.
we can make a bomb. Oliphant said to me 2 months. I think being realistic in those days, probably 5 months, but they
Mhm.
could stockpile weapons if they wished. Why were the Labor government coming to them? Because they'd just been absolutely pulverized in New Guinea. We'd had lost 50,000 men, and the fear was that we were going to consume by an Asian nation. End of
Yep.
story. That was it. And everyone who was alive then felt that pressure. And it was Americans came in, but they they didn't fight very well in New Guinea. They were number two to our blokes who were warriors who'd come from
Yep.
North Africa and so forth. But
Yep.
that's not enough excuse to say we don't need any weaponry to defend ourselves in the future.
Yep.
And they were, you can't name anyone they were thinking of at that time, but they said we don't want that again. We're an isolated nation at that stage, 7 million misplaced Europeans at the bottom of Asia, and remembering the Chinese had been wiped out 3 times the Australian population had been wiped out. The population of Australia now almost was wiped out by the Japanese. Do you think they would have worried about knocking off some whiteys down in in that big island called Australia? No, they wouldn't have. And our government knew this, and that's why they wanted Oliphant over there. Now, what happened was they had to write to the Prime Minister of England to get Oliphant back. He was that important. They said, no, no, he's developing our nuclear industry at Cherwell, in England, and they said you can't have him. He's contracted till 1949. So Oliphant came back at the request of the government, our government, in 1950. Now, by then, the Conservatives, the Liberals were in power, and Menzies did the ANZUS deal, and the Americans said, "Look, here's an umbrella. Well, you don't need to develop nuclear weapons. What do you want to do that for? Billions of dollars. We'll protect you. You're our little brothers in the Pacific. You fought with us in the Pacific. You fought with us in World War One, and two." So they said, and of course, Menzies, like every prime minister then, I think even Chifley and the rest of them would have
Mhm.
said, no, no, that's fair enough. We don't want to have to spend billions if the Americans are going to do it all.
Yep.
Now, Oliphant. has had a very different view of the Americans at that point. But anyway, that's where it stood. So he came back in 1950. He ran into a lot of bureaucratic opposition to his work because, who are you, the upstart from coming from Europe, England, telling us that you should have more funds for your operation than us? A very parochial reaction to him, and he was thwarted often. He did was part of the commencement of ANU. He did lecture and so forth. He had his own cyclotron being built. Things were going, but he realised that he'd made an error in his own altruistic, sort of jingoistic way of coming back to Australia. And the other great scientist at the time, Harold Florey, who developed penicillin, is from Adelaide as well, as it turned out, said to him, went to the actual wharf when he was taking off to go back to Australia. He said, "Don't do it. They're not going to be able to cope with it. You're too big. You're wanted here." And Oliphant was very naturalistic, and he felt he wanted to be with his extended family in Australia. He ended up living in Adelaide, in Canberra, not Adelaide. But he went back there because he thought I can do something great for the country. Didn't quite work out that way. He became governor of South Australia, which is part of my book Oliphant. But he never achieved the great accolades he was due in Australia. It's part of the reason I'm able to write a book that is going to be fresh in a lot of people's minds. I won't know about it. The other part is the opprobrium attached with developing atomic weapons was so great by the late 40s and early 50s. He was put up for a Nobel Prize for radar and for his developing fusion, which is, bombs. He didn't. The Norwegians and Swedes who sat around looking at the applicants, he wasn't an applicant. He'd been put up by Cambridge University. They said, "Oh no, I mean, he's a guy who developed atomic bombs." At that
Mm.
stage, the US, the French, the Chinese, and the Americans and the Brits, China, and France, were dropping hydrogen bombs on atolls in the Pacific. And everyone who had any humanity in them and knew what it was about said, this is not good for the environment, for anything. And so it just was not going to be credible that they'd give the greatest scientist of that war, of World War II, because of what he achieved. I talk about achievement.
Yep. Yep.
Einstein was the greatest theoretical scientist, probably of all time. It's hard, Newton and the others are there,
Yep.
Faraday, all these great scientists. But he was not an experimentalist. He could put it on the blackboard, but Oliphant did it in the lab and said, well, in fact, they were a bit scathing about the theoreticians. I did laugh. They said, we prove E equals MC squared every day in the lab. We changed the we changed the mass and the speed
Mm.
and said we can measure that. They weren't that impressed with Einstein's E equals MC squared. I think there was a bit of professional jealousy there, but he and
Yep.
Rutherford were a little scathing in their commentary about Einstein, who did lecture at Cambridge. But Oppenheimer wasn't anywhere near him in terms of experiment. He went over to Max Born. Oppenheimer's great area was black holes. And he never got to do them because he got bound up in the whole atomic stuff in America. And he never really settled into that area, which he would have probably made a bigger name for himself with. That's what he was in. He was it was Max Born he was under, but he developed the whole theory of black holes, which are now accepted by most of the scientific community as being a reality.
Yep. Yeah. So do you think the reason why Oliphant's not so well remembered in Australia is just because of that nuclear connection, or do you think it's a deeper
Well,
thing
you've
with
got to be here.
Australians?
He wasn't Don Bradman hitting balls to the boundary every other week in test matches
Mm.
and things. And he wasn't, his stardom was in Europe. This is Oliphant. And I mean, he was fated when he came back. I've got to say, they did meet him at the airport. The media in 1946 when he 1950 when he came back, they they made a meal of the whole thing. This great scientist, but it sort of died away after that for the reasons I've enunciated. And scientists don't get the accolades that sportsmen do or others do. That's just the
Yep.
way it is. And he didn't really get up on his hind legs and defend himself about his stuff. First of all, he wasn't a chess beater. He might have been a Ron wasn't, Ron Barassi wasn't either. But what I'm
Yeah.
saying is he wasn't the type to tell you, and I had many hours discussing with him on this sort of thing. He wasn't the type to tell you how great he was. He knew how great he was. You know,
Mhm.
Bradman knew how,
Yep.
Monash knew how great. They knew how great they were as individuals. They didn't have to tell you about it.
Yep.
And he was like that. But I could see his hesitation when we discussed this about, well, I did develop the bomb, and and he made very clear it wasn't just talking to me, but the motivation was singular: stop Hitler. That
Yep.
was in his head, accentuated by those great Jewish scientists that came to work with him, saying if we don't do it, they're going to get one. And they were only months away when the Japanese, well, once, sorry, they capitulated, but they're only months away of developing a bomb, as we now know from some of their scientists. So
Yep.
he was right on the money there. That drive that he had was enormous. And had he not been almost a bully with the Americans at one point, they would not have funded it. It would never have happened. And then you've got the issues of the war going on,
Yep.
particularly in the Pacific. The Japanese were not going to capitulate. All this rubbish about, oh, the Russians were coming down through Mongolia, and it's
Mm.
absolute academic drivel. They were going to fight to the last person until the emperor said it's over. And once the
Yep.
emperor said it's over, it was over.
Yep. So you've touched a couple of times on the development of the radar. Can you just give us a bit of an idea of what role he played in there, why radar itself was so important in
Yeah,
defeating Nazi Germany?
that's a good one. He said to me very early on, he said, "You know what a magnetron is?" He was 92, by the way, as sharp as a
Yep.
tack. And I said, and I went blank. I did know what it was. It's the basis for radar. And he said, it's the basis for all microwave ovens. And he said, I wish I had $1 for everyone in the world. And I laughed at that. It just that his attitude. And of course, all those great scientists, they didn't get their patents. Some of them did. Monash gave them out during World War One because he was a lawyer, and he said, "Look, you've developed a weapon there, and you need to patent that or a bit of a device." Didn't happen in World War Two so much. So he missed out on a serious fortune in terms of that sort of thing. He was half joking about it, because he was never going to be a rich man, being an academic and so forth. But
Yep.
um, he 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 was sui generis, one of a kind in that respect. And sorry, what was your original question there? I got sidetracked.
Yep. Now, what was his contribution to radar, and why was that
Oh, yes,
so
sorry,
important?
of course, that was big. Now he didn't invent radar. It was sort of lying there, another scientific development. There was no war on. Well, once that war geared up, he said, let's put radar dishes up and down the spine of the country once the Luftwaffe were bombing the hell out of the UK. Let's at least see them before and get our planes up in the air to fight them. So that was his first, because he was like that. He was very direct. That was his first contribution. And then he said, well, look, let's use radar, microwaves, small waves, in the front of planes and boats so we can see the enemy and attack them. So he turned a defensive weapon into an attacking weapon. He did both. And Hitler actually commented, not about Oliphant, but he said that was the one war weapon that he didn't have that he would have liked because they did stop the German attack. The Luftwaffe would have crushed England without that. It would have been obliterated. They would have to capitulate and put Edward the Eighth on the throne, again. They would have had to do that because that was probably going to happen if they'd won. So it was tremendous. So it was the development of the short wave, which is the best way to use it that he did. So he developed it. He's a bit like Flore um, in that respect because Flore developed penicillin. He didn't invent it. There was a Scotsman who invented it, sort of found it on his lab coat and didn't know what it was in a way. This is
Yep.
penicillin, the mold, and he developed it. He was driven like Oliphant, different reasons, but he had to go to the Americans for funding. And of course, all those millions of people that had gas gangrene and all the rest of it during World War II was saved by the fact that an Australian, Howard Florey from Adelaide, had developed penicillin. So very similar. They had to get the funding from the States, and they had to fight. They were really tremendous operators in that respect, driven, disciplined, hardworking. You wouldn't want to get in their way when they're working,
Yeah.
You'd have a bit of trouble. I mean, I didn't meet Flora. I wrote to him. I was only a student. He died in about 67. I got a letter back from him. It was a nothing event. I wanted to question him about certain things. I wasn't a journalist at that stage, but you could tell. I mean, all the stuff about him was that he was driven, disciplined, and they're the ones that get it done. They're
Yep.
the ones that get it done. So Oliphant was in that mold, and radar, and then the bomb. I mean, what else? The man
Yep.
was stupendous. Not
To be fair
appreciated.
to,
He's a knight. He's Sir Mark. He was a
okay.
professor and so forth. But I'm hoping this book will give him a greater recognition. In fact, if it goes well, not if it goes well, I still may do it. I'd have to get some other people to agree with me to do this. But I reckon we should write to the Nobel Committee again and say, how about giving
Mhm.
this bloke an award, because there's no one like
Yep.
him from World War II.
Yeah, sounds fair. So to be fair to say that he played a lead role in both the defeat of both Nazi Germany and Japan.
Well, that's right, he had, and that's see, he wouldn't want you to say that because it gets back to the
Yep.
weaponry and what happened in
Yeah.
Japan. But
Mm.
I had to not tease it out of him, but draw it out of him slowly that he was the mastermind, and he was the
Yep.
the general as well. And he said, "Right, we just got to do this, and we've got to, and I don't care who stands in my way." And a lot had to do with his record at that point. Everyone in England, all the brilliant scientists, knew this man was the outstanding scientist in UK at the time. And so he had that behind him. It's like saying, Ron Barassi had 10 premierships behind him. So when he said
Yep.
something, people
Yep.
listened,
Yep.
and
Yep.
that was Oliphant. He had this amazing record. Not in Australia, they didn't know much about him. That's why he ran into sort of petty, insular, bureaucratic nonsense when he came here with the ANU. He could have, had he had a more open government, a more intelligent government, he might have got some further backing. You've got to understand at one point, because the Americans were sniffy about him because he was against the hydrogen bomb.
Yep.
Oppenheimer was more subtle. He said, I'm not against it. I'm not going to be involved in the development. Whereas Oliphant got out there, having developed the atomic bomb, and said, no, this is too much. And you're just going to, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen on my watch, sort of thing, because it was happening. And he just went into the public area and said, we can't have hydrogen bombs. And here he was doing a deal at one point almost to have Screwdriver ready our own atomic pile. There's no contradiction here because he'd suffered in World War II. He thought he was going to die in England. And the Australians, all our parents and grandparents thought it could be the end, a little country or nothing. And they've got this mighty military regime, fascist regime marauding around Southeast Asia. We're stuffed.
Yep.
And he was right on, he was there at the time and he understood it. That was when they wanted the weaponry. And he wanted the nuclear industry first.
Yep.
He wanted nuclear power for the country. And I don't think, oh, well, I'm not going to give my personal account of it, but I do know of new technology that's coming on which will supersede the clean energy, which has nothing to do with the ridiculous windmills and stuff we're going through here. Can't
Yep.
believe, I can't believe with what I know about the technology there, and they're going to chop down bloody coal-fired plants. I know in England, in India, for example, and this is relevant to Oliphant because he introduced me to cold fusion. I had not a clue. I understood after dealing with him in my own work, study, not professional work, study
Yep.
about nuclear weapons, about how they're what goes into them. I didn't know about cold fusion, which is Tesla based. This is the
Yep.
old Nikola Tesla based
Yep.
free energy at atomic level, not nuclear level, right at the micro level. And he introduced me to that, and all I knew was I said, wasn't that destroyed by MIT? He said, yes. He said the fools crushed it, and the reason they crushed it, they're making hot fusion, which takes hundreds of billions of dollars a year, and a couple of innocent little scientists without his force developed this cold fusion idea based on Tesla's work, that was going to save the planet. And that was my introduction to it, and I'm going to be writing quite a bit about it, put it that way. But
Okay.
Oliphant was just a mine of information, you know.
Yep. So I understand both Oliphant and Oppenheimer were targeted, I suppose, by the CIA for a period.
That's absolutely
What
correct.
was?
The CIA had a file on both of them because they were called pinkos, you know, not quite red. I love that term, you know, pinkos. So Oliphant was, sorry, Oppenheimer was feared to be involved, and he was clearly pro-communist because he had his wife and brother, and everyone was in the Communist Party at that time. And Oliphant was a left winger. There's no doubt about that. He wasn't as politically involved apart from protesting hydrogen bombs, which is not a political matter. The US was doing it, the French were doing it, the Brits were doing it, and so forth. And we were involved by nuclear weapons being bounced on our soil here in South Australia. And so the CIA obviously had a file. I mean, I know they had a file. And ASIO followed in because they would pass stuff to the CIA from what Oliphant was doing in Australia. And Oliphant was not allowed to have a visa to the United States. I think it was about 8 years. I just couldn't believe that was the case. So had he got over to America, he would have defended Oppenheimer in the court system that he went through, who were trying to decide whether he should have a clearance for their operations, a government clearance. It would have ruined his career without it, and it did. And his eloquence and brilliance would have slapped the Americans around like nobody's business, and they were worried if he got over there, Oppenheimer would have his greatest supporter. And all the queasy, slightly gutless American scientists who just wouldn't support him in his operations and what he was doing would have stood aside with Oliphant there. He just said, well, he's very important for your country and what he did during World War II. Now, the question is, I've got to add the corollary that Oliphant, and I made this a sub theme in the book. The major theme was, first of all, obviously his impact on nuclear weapons and also radar. There's one and two. So I wanted those to be big themes. But on the way, it's what happens when you do a book. It's not a tweet. It's not 140 characters. It's 100,000 words. You say, oh, well, that's fascinating. And then you realize that five major Russian spies, Westerners who were picked up by the KGB, were placed by Oliphant in the Manhattan Project to build the bomb in key positions, which would have been, if they'd passed on information, as they did, some of them,
Mm.
would have been very useful for the Russians. Right.
Okay.
Now, there's no doubt he was behind. You know, I just draw the conclusion. I say I don't think it matters a damn now, because you've got Churchill talking to Stalin. You've got a lot of people thinking, well, they were mainly responsible for defeating the Nazis. When you look at, they lost 20 million
Yep.
people in
Yep.
doing that. So it's stupid. It's just narrow-minded, ridiculous to say the Russians weren't important, even though they had a monster running them in Stalin, which
Yep.
not even Oliphant acknowledged in the 30s. They didn't understand what was happening. And we only know in hindsight what a monstrous situation it was with gulags and millions being slaughtered and all the rest of it. But Oliphant didn't know. And he had these, remember I mentioned the collegiate thing before. He had all these scientists in the Soviet bloc whom they were brothers in arms in terms of development of atomic energy, not so much weapons. It was atomic, what they were doing in splitting the atom. And so, in the middle of this crushing by the CIA, not allowing him to have a visa, he went off to the Soviet Union, and they feted him. They had dinners and speeches and everything
Mhm.
because they thought, well, not that he's one of us, but we respect him for standing up to the Americans, which they loved, of course. You know, for
Yeah.
pushing the
Yep.
Americans. And he had guys like Pieter Kapitsa, who was a big guy at Cambridge, and they were mates. There's a lovely line from Kapitsa. I'll give it to you. Oliphant had a weird background, and the parents were very spiritual. They were theosophists. The old man wanted him to be a priest. It's a real contradiction to him
Yep.
to be a priest. he was a lowly worker in the government. But he was highly cerebral, highly bright, and he loved the
Yep.
whole Russian Revolution. He was a lefty, weird lefty in that aspect. And Oliphant was brought up. He was more interested in, experimenting. He didn't care about
Yep.
politics. By the time he got to Cambridge at 27, he's in a milieu of communism. They're all lefties, poor little rich boys at Cambridge and all the rest of it. They're going to change the world. They're going to bring the working class forward, all that. And he
Yep.
said to Kapitsa, who was a very bright senior physicist, older than him, he said this in about 29. He said, I don't understand why all you bright Russians accept all this communist rubbish, you see. And, and Kapitsa said to him, did you go to Sunday school? He said, yes. He said, same thing. The propaganda was the same thing.
Yeah.
That's a
Yep.
Russian point of view, an atheist point of view of God being given to you and Jesus being given to you if you're a Christian and whatever you. And Oliphant told me, he said the bulb went on above my head because I hadn't thought that much about it. But then I realized, of course. And then he became, it's all in the book, the letters that he wrote, and he spoke to the Atheist Society, he went to churches and spoke to congregations and giving his views about God. And he believed that the physicists were God and that they were dealing with the splitting of the atom and they had all the power to do the things that politicians couldn't do. For example, cleaning up the health problems in the world, doing all this stuff that we see happening. The one question I would have put to him, which I didn't at the time, I would have put on my interrogative hat and said, "Well, do you ever think that perhaps God made you?" It's the only answer it's the only answer the clergy have got, really. They can say,
Yeah.
"Well, you say that, and you say you're bigger than religion, but do you ever think that there's a power?" And of course, what a lot of them are now doing is they're getting close to some of the more detail about the universe, which is highly complex, but then some of them are getting close to a grand design. I know one guy,
Mhm.
I'm naturally a skeptic on this stuff, but I follow it because this guy is up in the Tesla class in terms of his intellect. His name is
Yeah.
Malcolm Bendall. He's a Tasmanian and he's into cold fusion. Now he believes profoundly in God and the rest of it, and I just look at what he does. It's not what he says in a pulpit. It's what he doesn't say it in a pulpit. It's what he invents. And I say, oh wow, where's that coming from? So it is more complex than saying, oh, he's an idiot because he believes in a higher being. It's much more complex than that. And anyone who says that really doesn't think deeply enough about what the universe is and what we are as humans.
Yep.
And now
That's right.
I'm on my soapbox now on an area I should be sticking to the book and the
Yeah,
themes of the
that's all good. So how do you feel we should remember or teach about Oliphant in the broader context of 20th century science and warfare?
well, I think it's the broader concept of science and warfare. I mean, he was our greatest scientist next to Flore, achiever. Let's add the word achiever. Say someone's the greatest is ridiculous. He
Yeah.
achieved at the critical moments. You often find in life, it's the ones that turn it on in the critical moments, and he turned it on. So he first of all, he's just achieved so much. Secondly, his science should be studied because it's still relevant, and moved me into cold fusion and trying to understand it. I mean, I didn't understand it for 30 years now. I do
Yeah.
understand it. He should be, his whole biography should be, I mean, I've written the book, of course, I'm saying this, but he is such a hero in the sense of great achievement. And for those who think, oh, I'm not bright enough for all that, 18-year-olds who might be watching this, remember he couldn't get into university where he wanted to go because he didn't have the motivation at that point. And it wasn't until someone said, look, oh, he actually saw what happened was Rutherford came to Melbourne and lectured, and he went to the lecture and he just was enthralled. He was speechless. He couldn't even go up to him. And Rutherford was a terrible lecturer. He'd start a sentence and he'd stop halfway and he'd go like this. And that's where he said, oh, we've got to go to Cambridge and work under him. And that's when he did a paper on Mercury, and that was good. And then and Rutherford said, I want to meet him. So he's an example of someone who's not a genius, who developed into a genius and
Yeah.
greater than all those around him, which is just one of those human stories. It's not always about the immediate IQ or how you're doing at school. It's often how you develop afterwards.
Yeah. Okay. So when you're writing this book, um, did your feelings or thoughts on anything change from when you started to when you finished?
No, not really. I thought about this a lot because you develop the book and you understand what happened to him episodically. I'm a biographer who writes chronologically, and I find I'm appalled and angry at those who jump around the genre, jump around the subject and don't follow through. They haven't got the skill to develop a narrative for a start, and they just pick little bits out. If you don't go through his whole life, you don't understand him, and you don't. The other thing is you don't the trick is to take on the complex science and make it digestible for anyone who can read. A bit like Rutherford saying, see that cleaning lady over there? If she doesn't understand what you've written, you don't understand it, which is the way writers are. Believe me, they get caught up in the gobbledygook thinking, well, the peer review will know that. That's not
Mhm.
the way to do it. So I was inspired by that. As far as things changing, I didn't really grasp the extent of the sub theme until I'd written the book and how many people
Mhm.
were placed. And I had to check all this. It took a bit of time, actually. All
Yeah.
the big spies like Klaus Fuchs and Alan Nunn May were under him at Birmingham. They weren't just in the Manhattan Project. And he's saying, oh, well, look, this guy's pretty good. Let's send him to Canada where you've got the uranium development. Let's send this one to the Manhattan Project. And he's getting what he wants because he's the great Oliphant. They all knew if he recommended Warwick O'Neill to go over and work in the
Mhm.
Manhattan, Warwick gets a run, you know.
Okay.
That's it. So he put all these spies in key places. He plucked a guy called Burup, Burrup, out of Melbourne University, who was a communist, and stuck him in the Manhattan Project. Now, whether that was for meeting, I mean, Klaus Fuchs, Nunn May, and others did. I met by the way, I met the controls of these people, the KGB controls in
Mhm.
Russia, in Moscow, on camera as we are now, and interrogated them
Okay.
and got the connection. I wasn't doing that for the Oliphant book. I did that for the Fifth Man and another spy book. So I went to them and said, you know, tell us about the people who were getting the information in the Manhattan Project. That I knew enough to do that. And they were saying, oh, this is this one. And then, of course, hit someone Oliphant had put in New York to work on the Manhattan Project. Or
Okay.
so it was clear, pretty clear. Look, if I'd been a little bit more opportunistic, and I wouldn't do it, I would have signed the whole book to was Oliphant. Did Oliphant get help the Russians get the bomb, or did he help
Mhm.
all those spies? That's the headline, right?
Yeah.
But the more important things was his other developments we've discussed at length here. And so I didn't make a mill of it, but it's in the book, and you'll read the development of how he handled it. Even the MI5 files I got hold of have some very stilted discussions of Oliphant saying, "Well, I didn't know anything about him being doing this. What do you think?" You know, this sort of stuff, talking to another scientist, and it was
Yeah.
all recorded by MI5. So it, from my experience, it just said that he knew these blokes were being sent across. He knew what they were doing. He wouldn't have been passing anything to the Russians himself. Um, and I even doubted what I had in my own book on the Fifth Man because the reason I got in to talk to him was that Rothschild, who was a key spy, Brits run away from this because they don't do their homework. Rothschild, who I had a great admiration for, another great scientist, stole a magnetron from Oliphant's laboratory. And I talked to Oliphant about that. That's how I got into the meeting him. And I thought a long time afterwards, I said, I wonder if he's realised I'm going to find out about the relationship, and they were at Cambridge together and all the rest of it. And I just wonder whether he actually gave him the magnetron. I don't have that in the Fifth Man. I don't have it in the Oliphant biography. But you do
Yeah.
wonder. You get a bit slight paranoia. Well, obviously, if he admires Rothschild, Rothschild was a Labour lord. He was a very
Mhm.
odd bird. At that point in history, he was a lord in the House of Lords, and he was the great Rothschild from the banking family. But he'd
Okay.
beaten MI5 and MI6, so people don't get confused. He really was an operator, as was his wife, Tess Rothschild. But it just made me think, did you get that right, Roland? I thought, with he's telling me, oh, yes, he stole a magnetite, put it in his pocket, and then he took it to Blunt. And then Blunt, another spy, took it to the resident KGB man at the Soviet embassy. Now, my advantage was I interviewed the resident KGB officer in Moscow on camera. His name was Barkovsky, Vladimir Barkovsky. And he said, he didn't say, oh, yes, Oliphant, Rothschild. He said, oh, yes, Blunt gave me the magnetron, right? Blunt would
Okay.
have met him down a dark alley somewhere, right?
Yep.
Or in a park and at night. So I had the full weaponry there and on how it happened. Rothschild takes it from Oliphant's lab, steals it or takes it to Blunt. Blunt takes it to KGB, a resident Barkovsky, and then he sends it off to Moscow. And this happened thousands of times with all of the operators there, the spies. And of course, did it matter because they were on our side during the war, the Russians, you know? If
Yep.
we weren't
Yep.
helping, it wasn't until the Cold War that everything went the other
Everything
way.
changed. Yeah.
George Orwell wrote so brilliantly about the realignment of nations after World War II.
Yep. Yeah. So, so what effect do you think Oliphant's discoveries and his work has got on more modern science and relations between Australia and its allies?
Well, you're talking about AUKUS here?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Well, this is fascinating because I can tell you from all our discussions, he was for nuclear power, right?
Yep.
So what are those subs? They're nuclear subs. They're not got, no one said the Australians are going to be having nuclear weapons in them, right? So this would have been right down his alley because he wanted any industry, any area of government to be nuclear powered. He said it was the best power. I happen to have other information about others. That's irrelevant. He was saying this to great scientists. And then you look and you say, well, wait a minute. And we discussed this at length because something that I'd done, we discussed at length. And that was you've got to go back a step. 1984, I'm living in London, and my information was that Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, did not have her finger on the nuclear button in the UK. The Americans had put cruise missiles up and down the spine of the UK. And Reagan, and whoever was going to be the president after him, had the finger on the button. The Brits didn't have it. Now, she was telling the world that she controlled the nuclear weapons, right? And I wrote an article in England, and then the Labor Party did a documentary on it. Um, I was friends with the head of art for Labor, and he said, "You've written this piece. Would you like to be involved in a doc?" So I was involved in a doc talking about it, and she was absolutely savaged in Parliament by the Labor Party for claiming that she had a finger on the button, and she didn't. Just think of it. What were the Americans doing? They're saying, it's going to be a nuclear war, World War III. We want it confined to Europe. How do you confine it to Europe? Or you think you can confine it to Europe? You have American missiles and you say, right, they're sitting there. So if a missile goes off and hits Russia, the Russians don't hit New York, they hit England if it's come from
Yeah.
England. That's in theory. It could all go haywire. No one should take this as being a blueprint.
Yep.
So when I wrote that piece, she got savaged. Now, fast forward to AUKUS. What are the Americans doing? They're saying, "Oh, you give us X billion dollars, and by 1932, you'll have a nuclear-powered submarine." And no one can tell me. I mean, I'd have to sit down with the head of the military in the US, and he'd probably have me bumped off before we met. I just don't believe they're not going to be able to be switched on, the screwdriver ready, to make nuclear weapons. It doesn't make sense. They're going to float around the Pacific. And who's controlling them? Not the Brits. They're in Europe. And we're the patsy. We're the fall guy now. Where Thatcher was with the missiles on the UK. We're in that position. we're going to be working with the Americans. Say there's a Barney over Taiwan when these nuclear subs are ready. It's a lot of ifs in there, but we're going to be the ones that cop it because we've got the nuclear subs. That's my argument against. I think AUKUS, I understand what they're doing, but they haven't spelt this out. No one convinced me
Yep.
that they haven't got the capacity now even to make nuclear weapons on the boats themselves, on the U-boat, the submarines. No one can convince me of that. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of hoo-ha going on now at Garden Island, which is our nuclear base, our weapons submarine base. The Americans are there in droves, and they are setting things up right now for what might happen in the future. I'm not wanting to be, to frighten everyone, but do have contacts and they tell me things from time to time about what's happening. Then you had the idiot Chinese going down the east coast of Australia, firing weapons and having war games. I
Mm.
mean, how dumb are they? Do they not know that we know they would be attacking the Western Australian side and Darwin and the north, not the east coast? If there's going to be a fight, they're going to knock out Garden Island, where the submarine base is. So, I mean, this was a stupid decoy for anyone who knows anything about, but the Chinese shouldn't have been so bellicose about it. But anyway, we'll just see
Yeah.
what happens with them.
That's
I,
that's the way it's going at the moment, though, isn't it? So,
yeah, it is. It's very difficult to know what's going on. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. So if you could sum up what you would like Oliphant's legacy to be in Australian history, how would you sum it up?
Well, as I've said a few times now, I think he's our greatest achiever. So to study his work and his technology and what he wanted gives us a leg up. Now, the mere fact that I mentioned the introduction of cold fusion. And it was amazing when I spoke to him about it. It was 94, and that for 5 years, MIT and others had tried to crush this technology. And he just laughed at, oh, MIT, they know what's going on. He said, there's a reason for that. And he explained it to me, getting so much
Yep.
money to stop it.
Yep.
So whatever he has got into with his mighty mind, it's going to be part of the evolution and a revolution, another industrial revolution, and it's good to study the way he went about it, to study the papers for those real scientists, not like me, an
Yep.
observer, an author, but real scientists study nature when he brought up that paper in 1934, study his career and how he got the atomic bomb, study his career on radar and understand it, and then move up to what his futuristic commentary was about cold fusion. And then you have a great knowledge base, which we don't have to the extent we should. That's all I can say about Mark.
Well, it sounds very good. Oh, well, thank you for coming in today and speaking to us. Certainly, I'd never heard of him before, so
Well, that's good.
it's very interesting.
I'm glad that you've gotten onto this because it's going to be big in the next couple of years. Some of the stuff, as I say, the cold fusion stuff, and I'm going to give credit to Oliphant for kicking it off. Not with
Yep.
me so much. He was the one saying, "Oh, look, you have no idea what's going to happen." I mean, if you know anything about Tesla, Nikolai, and I know just about as much as you probably do, but he believed in free energy, and that's why he was squashed by, was it Westinghouse and JP Morgan, because they thought, oh God, our industries are going to go under if free energy is around, right? If they can
Yep.
develop, your electricity bills go down to zero and everything else. Well, that's where Oliphant is to a point in fighting for uh, his his bomb and his radar. And then you've got another bloke, this Australian called Bendall, Malcolm Bendall, and Cold Fusion, developing a thing called the thunderstorm generator, which is for all combustion engines, which will kill carbon and have oxygen come out the end, which was discussed with me in general terms with Oliphant. So that is going to be part of the legacy. His work is going to be part of the legacy that we'll all know about if we're allowed in the
If we're
next.
allowed.
I think we will be. I think we will be. And this sort of interview helps people open their minds a bit, think, well, what's it all about? What is he about? What's cold fusion about? I'm hoping.
Yep. Well, let's hope so. Okay. So, where can people get Get a copy of Oliphant, all the usual bookshops and
Yeah,
online.
yeah, the usual roundup of good and bad bookshops, and
Yep.
you can look up. I'm being interviewed. There's a podcast on a thing called Alchemical Science, where I actually interview. I'm interviewed by the principal about Oliphant, so it'll be another interview, but it goes into it in a different way from you. And then I've on camera interviewing Indians and Australians who are developing this cold fusion technology. So everyone who wants to know the connection with Oliphant into the future, the cold fusion is the way to go. And that's all spelled out. And I do my very best in writing or in answering questions to you. People can make their own judgment in making it digestible without talking down to people, because that's going to get it out there. You've got to beat all the jargon that is put up. I mean, even the guys working on cold fusion, every day I'm reading stuff from them. Now they are in hugely intelligent men, but they don't, and women, they don't break it down. They don't tell you, oh, well, this will kill carbon. I use that language, and
Yep.
oxygen will come out the exhaust. I say, look, guys, what are you talking about here? So I just hope that this is part of the beginning of comprehension of all that.
Yep. Sounds good. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you. There it is. There's the book.
The book,
As I
Oliphant.
said, I think I said to you, it's the one book I've had where I can genuinely say, please judge a book by its cover. I couldn't say that everyone I've done, but that one definitely, yeah.
Yep. Beautiful. Okay. Well, thank you for coming.
A great pleasure, and thanks for drawing it out nicely. I enjoyed
No
it.
worries. No
Okay.
worries.